Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. My guest today on Podcast for Inquiry is Robin Reames. Robin is the incoming Culbertson Chair of English at Indiana University. She researches and writes about the history of ideas, particularly lost ideas from the ancient Greek rhetorical tradition that can enrich our lives today. She is the author of 2 books, Seeming and Being in Plato's Rhetorical Theory, and the book we're going to discuss today, The Ancient Art of Thinking for Yourself, The Power of Rhetoric in Polarized Times. In today's episode, Robin tells us what rhetoric is. We discuss facts and how emotions and values are more compelling persuaders. Robin tells a modern-day Rashomon tale. We discuss whether media reports on what happened or conditions you on how to respond. The power of the word alternative. The power of fear. And lessons we can learn from ancient Athens and much, much more. It is a great pleasure to bring you my conversation with Robin Reames. Robin Reames, thank you for speaking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So we're going to be talking about your book, The Ancient Art of Thinking for Yourself, The Power of Rhetoric in Polarized Times. And you grabbed me right from the title, so well done with that. It's something that I think everybody wants to do these days, and everyone claims to do these days, is I think for myself. And that's, I think, sort of encapsulated by the very common phrase that we hear these days, do your own research. So I'd like you to start by defining for me and our audience, what is rhetoric, and how does an understanding of rhetoric help you think for yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question. The first thing I would say is that the title's a little bit of a misnomer, because I don't really think it's fully possible ever to entirely think for oneself. We're always going to be thinking in and through a different set of ideas, a set of ideas that are in many ways kind of set down for us or laid down for us by a set of theories, by a history, by a tradition. Whether we're aware of the way that various ideas that we've inherited from history, from our culture, are impinging on our thinking, that's another question. But nevertheless, I think people have a tendency to think they're thinking for themselves, or they have a desire to think for themselves. They want to break out of the bounds of thought that are sort of preset for them. That's kind of a natural impulse or desire. So what I'm trying to teach people in the book is how the tradition and the history of rhetoric can facilitate and open up new paths for thought. I think we have too few tools at our disposal these days to think differently. We're locked into certain ways of thinking that in many cases are set by our political affiliations, whether we consider ourselves to be a liberal, whether we consider ourselves to be conservative. We have a tendency, whether we're aware of it or not, to latch on to sort of prepackaged opinions that have been laid out in grooves for thinking. So there are so many different ways that it's possible to think by putting on a different set of lenses. So the set of lenses I'm trying to offer people in this book are, as you say, a set of lenses that are inherited from the rhetorical tradition. So what rhetoric is, and it's taking me a little while to get to your question, just to say that's important background information to have in mind. We should be dubious of our ability to completely break free of any sort of influenced thinking, but we can begin to realize that there are many, many more choices and many more ways of thinking than the ones that come automatically to us, or the ones that are kind of most present in public
even
discourse.
If it's an impossible ideal, it might be worthwhile if we can approach it closer, either by a step or by a leap. But if we can get closer to that ideal, there's still improvements to be had. Yes.
Or I don't know if I'd call it an ideal, but I would say it's experienced as independence, right? It's experienced as a kind of independent thought when we find something new that opens up a whole new world of thought for us. And I think that's what rhetoric can give us.
Okay.
Rhetoric,
So what
original.
is rhetoric, and how can it help us open up these new areas of thought, new
There we go.
expanses to explore?
Rhetoric at its inception, rhetoric began in ancient Greece. It began in the 5th and the 4th centuries BCE in ancient Greece. So 5th and 4th century, think 5th century, think Socrates. 4th century, think Plato and Aristotle. And that was the beginning. That was the inception of it. And it began as really the first discipline devoted to the study of language as language. It was the first discipline that was devoted to studying how language works, how it persuades people to believe and think certain things, how it influences action. And the whole reason that it evolved in the time that it did, alongside other disciplines like philosophy, like biology, like science, right? All of that terminology was arising at the same time in the same place, because the world was getting carved up by those philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. But in rhetoric's case, it began to be studied in that time, and the discipline originated in that time precisely because Socrates, Plato, Aristotle observed this connection between language persuasion and political disaster, essentially. And they saw the ability of, in a democratic system of government, of people's ideas being warped beyond recognition by the power of language. So that essentially is rhetoric. Rhetoric is the study of language, and specifically the study of the persuasive uses of language towards like social and political action, social and political ends.
I have a visceral memory of my first encounter with rhetoric. Although I didn't have the word for it, that I didn't know how to describe it. I was in grade 10, and I was a bit of a keener, and we were studying Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's play. Mm-hmm. And I read ahead of the class, and I came across Mark Antony's speech. And just to establish context, Caesar is a conquering hero. He's hailed as a hero. He's loved by the citizens of Rome, and some conspirators worry that he was turning into a dictator, so they assassinate him, and they make their case, and then the polity of Rome went from hailing Caesar as the conquering hero to hailing the conspirators, to saving them from a dictator. And so they're thanking them for saving us. Thank you for saving us from a dictator, says the Romans. Mm-hmm. And then Mark Antony stands up and he gives his speech, and he talks for about 10 minutes. I mean, it depends how fast you say it, but it's about a 10-minute speech. And over the course of this speech, he turns the Roman citizenry from adulating the conspirators into a murderous mob. And he just did that through speech. And I'd seen movies where there's, you convince someone, but it was always like a psychological trick. You experienced this as a child, and you manipulate them based on their personal experience. This was just like the people writ large. And I must have read that talk or that speech, that monologue, 50 times, because it was just fascinating. Like how does he do that? And I went back, and how does he do that? And it's really compelling. And if you haven't read it, I mean, it's easily available. And I'm curious, and I wish I'd known that there was something called rhetoric that at the time I learned the term, before reading your book. How did you first come across rhetoric, and what made you decide to devote your career to its study and to its dissemination to as many people as possible?
Yeah, that's a great example. That's actually one of the most famous examples of so-called epideictic rhetoric, right?
Okay, that you're going to have to. Now you're using words that I am unfamiliar with. So please.
So epideictic rhetoric, as it was defined at the beginning by Aristotle, was a speech of praise or blame, right? I come not to praise Caesar, but to bury him, right?
Yes.
It's the speech of it's an encomium, and the brilliant thing about that piece of epideictic rhetoric is, as you point out, it actually achieves political ends, right? So Aristotle said epideictic is different from legal rhetoric and judicial rhetoric and legal rhetoric or deliberative rhetoric, because it's not really trying to get people to do anything, right? You're just praising someone, you're just blaming someone. The audience is supposed to be a spectator. And the idea is that the audience kind of lets their guard down in that case because there's really nothing on the line. All that's happening is somebody's being praised or somebody's being blamed. But this was a brilliant example because
Yeah.
actually,
Well, and he says that, like,
their
that's
guard
actually
down.
in the speech, right? I come not to praise Caesar, but to bury him. But and he kind of stays with that, but he's actually praising them. Like, he gets people to love Caesar so much that
Right.
they are infuriated that he's now gone, and they kill all. I mean, they're so riled up that somebody who happens to share a name with a conspirator isn't the guy, but shares a name with him. That's close enough, and they kill him too. Like, it's. I mean, of course, it's a play, it's fiction, it's dramatized, but if you read it, and if you can hear a good actor give that speech, like, it's hard not. I mean, you can't help but understand why they were whipped up into such a frenzy. Even though he never says, go out and kill the conspirators, even though he never says, Julius Caesar was the greatest person ever to live, and now his light has been snuffed out. That's not how he does it. That's not how it's done.
Well, Shakespeare knew what he was doing. He read quite a bit of rhetoric. He'd studied quite a bit of rhetoric. We know some of the rhetorical texts that he read, which were all, well, now you're getting me to nerd out, but he knew.
I'm a nerd too. Please nerd away. A large portion of our audience are also nerds.
So are they all honorable men. But how I came to rhetoric in the first place, I came to rhetoric in a really roundabout way. I mean, as I discuss in the book, I think I've always had a longstanding interest in language. I mean, my interest in language sort of was amplified and augmented as my mind began to change as a young adult. And I realized that so much of my own beliefs growing up were really predicated on a kind of power of language. And I was thinking specifically of being raised in a kind of very intensely religious and conservative context in the Deep South, in the United States Deep South. And so that sort of fascination with the power of language and that interest in the power of language was kind of always looking for an answer. I was always looking for a sort of explanation for it. I didn't have access to rhetoric in the same way that Shakespeare did because, not too long after Shakespeare's day, rhetoric went into a really steep attrition. It stopped being studied as rhetoric, as what Shakespeare would have envisioned it to be able to do and what he dramatized its ability to do. Precisely because in the modern era, just a century or so after Shakespeare, it came to be seen as just mere ornamentation, window dressing on language, and not this power to move souls and minds and propel people to action. And so there were not classes on rhetoric. I didn't see books on rhetoric until after my undergraduate education, but I think my fascination with language led me to study English literature. And so that's where rhetoric still lives, in these like kind of small little enclaves in English departments. That's where it's still studied. It's still studied also a little bit in classics and a little bit in communication. And so that's where I found it. And I think when I first encountered it, it was really just like this sigh of relief. I was like, this is what I've been looking for. I've been looking for a discipline, which I didn't even know existed up until that time, that can explain the power of language, that explains what language can do that I see in the world around me, but that also I'd experienced in my own life as a young girl. So that's really how I came to it. The first book on rhetoric that I bought was actually the compilation, The Rhetorical Tradition. It's the anthology of readings from the entire history of rhetoric. And that's the book that I'm now the editor of, the third edition of. But that was the first book on rhetoric that I bought.
So now rhetoric is a tool, and like any tool or any technology, it's value neutral, I would think, in and of itself. And what I certainly would applaud someone to be able to use rhetoric to be able to more articulately and more accurately convey their ideas and thoughts. But it can also be used to manipulate or as we just discussed with Mark Antony's speech and Julius Caesar. But you write also about how people can use words, and this is a quotation from your book, to deny reality is a rhetorical maneuver that carries a distinct rhetorical power. And you cite the examples of flat earthers or the faked moon landing. And when I read that, I was a little bit curious because I thought, like, one definition of civilization is that we define civilized behavior as using language and not force or blackmail, extortion, or other forms of coercion to persuade. We use words to discuss and debate and to change people's minds, and not more coercive, brutal tactics. So do you invest words with a distinctive power, or is it just something like one tool that people can use among many to convince others of the truth or falsity of any kind of proposition or worldview?
Well, I think, Leslie, to begin, I think those are maybe two separate questions. So
Okay.
I'll take them separately, because I think there's a question that you're asking about the neutrality of words, or the genre of words in propelling or achieving or obtaining a certain outcome or action. But then there's another question about what happens when words are used to deny reality. And so I think those are two sort of separate issues,
Right.
or at least the rhetorical tradition treats
let's
that
take them
as
one at a time.
Yeah. So one is that, rhetoricians since Aristotle, not even since Aristotle, since before Aristotle, with the sophists, the sophist Gorgias from the 5th century BC, before Aristotle, who was really the sophist that arguably Plato had the worst things to say about, or Socrates via Plato had the worst things to say about. There's a longstanding understanding that words, language, aren't really necessarily how we think of them. They're not necessarily a report of reality. They're actually on a continuum with violence all the time, any kind of words. And the reason that rhetoricians have always seen them on a sort of shared continuum with violence, and they don't mean that in a bad sense, they mean that in just a sort of descriptive sense, is that both words and coercion, words and bodily force, are both used to get other people to do certain things in a certain way. Like this is how we get other people to act, believe, behave, respond in certain ways. We use, on one end of the scale, on one far end of the continuum, we can use force or violence. On the other end of the scale, on the other end of the continuum, we can use words. And so there's almost not there's a neutrality in a sense in the way that you're describing, yes, but it's never like a full neutrality, because the function of words socially and politically is to affect a kind of change on people other than ourselves, other humans, right?
Right. Oh no, I guess what I meant is that it's a tool. It's a technique that we have, that we can persuade. We can actually change people's minds. We can change what you do tomorrow might be different based on what I say to you today. So it definitely, words can definitely have an effect. What I meant was whether they're put to moral or immoral purposes is independent of is dependent on how good you are with words, how effective you are, but whether it's put to I'm not describing this well. What I'm trying to say is the impact on the world, whether you make a positive impact or a negative impact, whether your actions are moral or immoral, is independent of your skill with rhetoric.
Yeah, absolutely. And the former would be an ethical or moral question more than a rhetorical one, if that makes sense.
Right. Yes.
Like it's less of a rhetorician's domain, it's less of my domain, it's less of my area of study to make judgments of that nature. What rhetoric has always been interested in being able to do since the beginning is being able to take a step back from language and assess and explain how it does what it does. And that explanation is equally powerful and equally important, whether the outcome of the language is desirable and good and judged to be moral or undesirable and bad and judged to be immoral, right? So a rhetorician would be equally interested in being able to offer a precise and compelling explanation, regardless of what the ends the language were put to. But the other question you asked is this function of language to be able to deny reality. And in the book, I address that specifically because it's this explanation from the rhetorical tradition that one set of rhetorical theorists from the 20th century really sort of are puzzled by, or they note the sort of uncanny nature of fact denial as a rhetorical method. So like in the way that I was just describing, like a rhetorician would want to be able to describe how the language is doing what it's doing. These two rhetoricians, Chaim Perlman and Lucille Brooks-Titeka, wanted to offer an explanation of how such disastrous decision-making in the 20th century, in 20th century European politics could have taken place. And they noted there's something really powerful that happens when people deny facts, when people deny the reality of a situation. It's like all of a sudden everything is thrown into limbo. And it doesn't have the same power to assert that something is the case. It has this particular power when we assert that something is not the case. And just that kind of observation about the rhetorical power of fact denial is like just one example of that ability that rhetoric is supposed to hone, of giving people the ability of taking a step back from the language and observing that pattern, right? Over time, with repetition, when you see this happen over and over again, you observe it has a particular kind of power that's unlike other forms of language.
So is that like, there's an old expression, the best defense is a good offense. And so I don't have to prove my case. I just need to show that you're wrong. There's a scene in a movie called Thank You for Smoking. And there's a father who's a PR flack, and he's talking to his son, and he says, and they're at like a county fair, and they each have ice cream, and he says, which do you like better, chocolate or vanilla? And the kid says, chocolate. And says, okay, fine. Why? Says the father. This kid says, well, because chocolate tastes better. It makes me happy. It's got more ingredients. It's more interesting, a more complex palate. He goes a whole list of reasons why chocolate is better than vanilla. And the father looks at him and says, no, you're wrong. He says, really? Why? Why is vanilla better? He says, because I'm for America. I'm for choice. I'm for freedom. And I don't understand why you're against these key values. And the son says, but you didn't actually make your case. You didn't say why vanilla is better than chocolate. He said, I don't have to. This is public opinion. All I have to do is show you're wrong. And if I do that, then I'm right. So are these the types of tools that you're talking about, the techniques that a skilled, if somewhat amoral rhetorician would use?
Not use, would observe happening, catalog, and explain. So rhetoric is mistaken. It's often mistaken for an art of teaching people simply how to persuade people. And while that certainly is
skilled in the art of rhetoric, then
someone skilled in the art of rhetoric would be able to tell you why that's persuasive, right? Why that turn to values that seems like a complete non sequitur and totally irrelevant, which it is, would be persuasive. And actually, those same rhetorical theorists, that they have an explanation for that as well, right? And it's actually part of their analysis of facts. We have this tendency, as I just explained in the book, we have this tendency to think of facts as these sort of fixed, immutable, and therefore probably more persuasive elements when used in rhetoric. If I use facts, right? If I just riddle my rhetoric with facts, it's going to be really persuasive because the facts are the facts, right? Mm-hmm. They actually point out, no, it's the opposite, because in rhetoric, anytime you marshal a fact, all it takes to make your facts fragile is for someone to deny them, right? All it takes for the facts to be drained of their factuality, at least as far as the rhetoric is concerned, the persuasive power of the rhetoric, is for someone to deny them. And actually, it's the reverse case with values, as this example from Thank You for Smoking just brilliantly illustrates. Values, which are subjective, right? They're amorphous, they're nebulous, they're personal, they're particular to an individual, we would think. And so therefore, they're not nearly as compelling in an argument. Actually, they point out it's the opposite. Whereas we think facts would be the more compelling thing and values the more subjective and therefore the more fragile element in rhetoric. It's actually the reverse. And the reason they explain is that values, because they are so abstract, they can mean really anything to anybody. And because they're so valued by such a large number of people, right? Freedom, America, choice, right? These things. It's not really possible to say, no, your values are meaningless, right? Your values are useless. That would not be convincing to someone. And so values actually have this profound staying power. They can be used in entirely irrelevant cases or entirely irrelevant situations precisely because they're so fungible in that way. So yeah, a rhetorician wouldn't be there. And a rhetorician's interest is not limited to teaching a person how to use those skills. A rhetorician is first and foremost much more interested in being able to explain how those techniques are used to persuade in the first place, as opposed to just sort of giving a primer on how to be a persuasive speaker.
All right. I want to go back to the first part of that last answer, because the word facts was doing a lot of work there. And I wonder if when I think of a fact, I'm thinking of something that not only is true, but like is generally known to be true, like is accepted as accurate by all parties, right? And when you're saying if simple denial of it, I'm wondering if it's helpful to think of a difference between a claim and a fact. Like even if I say something and it may or may not be true, and there's a matter of trust involved. Do you trust that I am accurately conveying reality, or do I have an agenda? Am I untrustworthy? Might I be lying, or might I be spinning things? So if I don't, if there's not a level of trust between two people talking, then then anything I'm saying, whether it's accurate or not, is not going to be accepted as a fact. Does that enter into the rhetorician's study, or the difference between a claim and a fact, something that is provisional or distrusted and something that is accepted, or is that sort of beyond the rhetorician's scope?
No, it's within a rhetorician's scope, but I think I would kind of push you a little bit on your desire to distinguish between a fact and a claim. Okay. Because what a rhetorician would want to point out is, give me an example of a fact that isn't in the form of a claim, right? Give me an example of a fact that isn't stated as a claim, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, a fact would, I would certainly agree with you that a fact is a subset of a claim. So that, not all claims are facts, but all facts may start out as a claim.
Well, the important thing to recognize then is that we have this tendency to think, and this is in large part a result of the fact that we did, as I mentioned, we began to stop studying rhetoric in the modern era, and that precipitous attrition has only increased from the modern era to now. We have a tendency as a result of that to bypass the language and think about what's beyond the language. A fact is just a report of the things out there in the world, and not pay attention to the language that the fact is packaged in, which is going to be in the form often of a claim, right? Or a piece of evidence in support of a claim. So a rhetorician would want to call your attention to the way a fact is being reported, the way a fact is being marshaled, the way a fact is being used as evidence in support of the claim, the way a fact is actually functioning as a claim. A rhetorician would want to call your attention to all of that linguistic packaging in order to diagnose how it's influencing the way that you think, the way it influences your understanding of reality, the way it influences your beliefs about what's out there in the world.
Yeah, I had a big aha moment in your book, because you identified something that I had noticed and it was really bothering me, but I hadn't been able to identify, and you put a finger on it. And I'll quote you here, because I wrote it down, that there's when referring to journalism, there's a lot of journalism that is not in the category of reporting what happened, but the category of telling you what to think about what happened and how to behave in response. And that I see that, and as soon as I read that and I started reading headlines in the first paragraph of articles, I see it everywhere. It's not this politician laid out this, their policy agenda, boom, right? That would be reporting what happened. But it's like scandal, politician will rob widows and orphans so that they cannot eat. And then it'll be, like some cut to some program of which perhaps widows and orphans are a member of that class. Like there is a grain of truth in there, but the headline and the subhead in the first paragraph are really about scandal. That, like, you need to be shocked, you need to be scandalized, and this is how you need to think about whatever information we're about to present. Like, the framing is there. The framing that exists is entirely emotional, and then the facts come much later. I would prefer I would prefer journalism that was more factual, and I'm capable of doing my own analysis, but that is increasingly rare. So I want to say thank you for because I there was something that bothered me, but I couldn't quite say what it was. And how do we get back to, or am I the only one who's bothered by this, or is this something that bothers you? Let me ask actually a question instead of monologuing so much here.
No, I mean, absolutely. It bothers me, but you don't thank me, thank Aristotle, right? I mean, Aristotle was the one who identified the need to categorize discourse according to its purpose and its end. And when we don't study rhetoric, we don't think about it that way, right? We think about it as just an account of what's out there in the world. But in fact, Aristotle said it's very important to think about what end the discourse is meant to produce. Is it trying to get you to make a judgment? If it's trying to get you to make a judgment, is it trying to get you to make a judgment? And so that leads to some kind of future action. If it's leading to some future action, what action is it trying to get? Like, very rarely in the rhetoric is any of that going to be explicit. It's going to be implied. It's going to be buried. So it's up to the person who studies the rhetoric and consumes the discourse to pay attention to that, right? So, and as you pointed out, one of the first things that you begin to notice when you start thinking that way is you notice that intense, emotional, and value-laden language. It's like one of the first things that begins to kind of present itself in a new way, because all of a sudden you're like, well, this is less of a report and more of a guiding me to think in one way or another. And absolutely. And what's interesting to me as a rhetorician, and I would say it bothers me in some sense, but it also doesn't bother me in another sense, because what else are we going to do, right? As language users, there's something inevitable about this. But what it guides you to do is to notice that it's happening all the time and everywhere, and even in news outlets with a really high journalistic standard, where there are numerous checks in place, and those checks that are in place are like explicitly spelled out in editorial guidelines. All of those checks are actually meant and intended by those news outlets to try to keep a lid on that, to try to keep a cap on that, because it's a natural human tendency. As language users, This is how we use language. But it's up to us as people as students of rhetoric to begin to notice it. And we begin to notice it when the rhetorical tradition teaches us how. It teaches us the flags for it. There's another rhetorical theorist who much later on in the 20th century noted, really all discourse aims to produce some kind of social action. I mean, that's why we're out here talking to each other. That's why we use language. Right. But if we don't think about it,
have goals with Podcast for Inquiry. Yes, absolutely.
Exactly. But if we don't think about it in that way, we're not going to notice those things. And if we're not noticing those things, we're not really thinking as critically as we should be.
Right. So I've said it before in other conversations on this podcast, that we are social storytelling animals, we humans. And you, in your book, tell a modern day version of Rashomon, which is a Japanese fable made famous by Akira Kurosawa's film of the same name. And there's a series of events. And over the course of the film, of the play, the story, you get 5 different versions of what are purportedly the same events, but taken from different perspectives. And they tell very different, you come away with a very different impression of what happened in these events from that story. And you tell the story of a father and a daughter in your book. And you give the story from one perspective and then the other, but they're talking about the same thing. Can you tell us very briefly the perspective of the father, the perspective of the daughter, and then tell us what, then provide the context of who the father and daughter are?
Sure. Yeah, this is just an example of how reality, again, which we tend to think of as just out there, and the language is a clear glass,
Yeah,
just
but
reporting
how
what's
we present the
there,
facts are
right?
so important.
But it's almost always reported to us in the form of a story. And good luck not packaging. As I said, there are these grooves that are laid down for our thinking. There are grooves that are laid down for our language. One of those grooves is narrative structure. We tend to structure the world when we talk about it and when we think about it according to a kind of narrative. There's a plot, there's something happening, they're main characters, right? The main characters are at the fore, they're trying to do something in the world, they have a purpose, they have props that they use happening in front of a scene, right? They're in a setting. And yeah, the story I give is kind of two versions of there's this father whose daughter struggles with mental health and drug addiction, and he's spent his entire life trying to help her get her back on her feet. And finally, he had to kind of take over her finances and take over her decision making for herself. And finally, he was able to introduce some stability in her life, and things finally calm down. And then she goes and accuses him of abuse and coercion, abusive behavior and coercive behavior. And then there's another story of a young woman who is, skyrockets to fame at a young age and is megawatt talented and, just brimming with all kinds of potential and talent. And because she makes so much money, her father finds a way to, she ends up struggling with some mental health, and her father finds a way to get her finances out of control, pays himself a generous salary, and basically keeps her under house arrest, right? Obviously, I'm talking about Britney Spears, right? And the Free Britney movement. But it's not really possible to package that scenario in something other than a story. It's not ever possible to just fully give nothing but a report of the facts. Or if it is, it's not going to be very memorable. It's not going to be very compelling. That's one of the reasons I would say, it's frustrating when we see this happen in journalistic outlets. But on the other hand, it's not frustrating because it's the way language works. It's the way language functions. And in that example, I was trying to say, on the one hand, good luck trying to capture that story without putting it inside of a narrative, right? Without putting inside of some kind of structure in that way. But also, the important thing for rhetoricians is to note that any time that we find a story to be really compelling, we find it compelling because we're identifying with it. It looks like reality to us. It seems realistic to us. It seems believable. We can imagine ourselves in it. That's why this one rhetorical theorist from the 20th century named Kenneth Burke called this dramatistic, right? He called identification, his word for persuasion was identification. It's not so much that you've been consciously, rationally persuaded to believe something, like you've thought it through and said, yeah, I believe it. No, it's more that there was a compelling narrative and you kind of identified with it. You identified yourself with it. It's identification more than it's persuasion, which is another way of saying it's more passive than active. It's more automatic than kind of carefully reasoned out, carefully thought through.
Yeah, you write that compared to facts, values and emotions have tremendous staying power once they are introduced in rhetoric. And that's entirely true. One of my favorite quotations by Henri Poincaré, he wrote that an accumulation of facts is no more a science than a heap of stones is a house. I've learned this just through my own work at the Center for Inquiry Canada. You can't just list a bunch of facts. I mean, you can, but no one's going to care. You need a framework, you need context, you need mnemonics, you need to be entertaining, you need to tell a story. And then you embed the facts, you embed the message that you really want to convey in all of that, so that you have an implicit answer to, so what? I mean, if you're listing facts, someone's always thinking, so what? Why should I be paying attention? So there's a whole suite of tools that you need to use in order to make your story compelling, or to make your message compelling. And usually it's embedding it in some kind of story. So is rhetoric special in that regard? Is it unique, or is it one tool among many? Or is it the most powerful, or is it really the only thing that matters when it comes to that goal?
To the goal, to which goal?
To the goal of persuasion,
To the goal of
sorry, no, not to the goal of effective communication, of getting getting an idea, a thought, an emotion across from one person to another.
So, I mean, again, I would say that rhetoric is not limited to skills of effective persuasion and communication. First and foremost, it's an ability of being able to see how that happens, right? And that doesn't necessarily even mean that it's effective. It doesn't even necessarily mean that it's highly skilled or well honed. Rhetoric wants to be able to observe language X produced outcome Y. How did that happen, right? If we can observe that happening over and over again, can we develop a term for that? So that we can understand why that's the case. That when technique X in the language is used, it could predictably produce outcome Y. So rhetoric is distinct in that, and it's unique in that it's always been interested in being able to develop a theoretical taxonomy, a theoretical vocabulary for explaining how and why language X produces outcome Y. There's no other discipline that's devoted exclusively and deliberately to that. It was the first discipline for that. But if what you're asking is that is rhetoric the only discipline that observes or is concerned with how facts don't function independently? No. Scientists point this out all the time. Philosophers of science point this out all the time. Philosophers point this out all the time, right? The rhetoric's not alone in its concern with what we presume to be what we presume facts to be, as opposed to what facts are in a certain discourse or in a certain discipline. But rhetoric is unique in its ability to say, okay, my concern with language forces me to want to offer a vocabulary that explains how this language produces that result. That's unique about rhetoric.
Yeah, there's something that I learned fairly recently, and then I read it in your book as though so it's obviously not a new insight, and that was this is what you wrote: when people speak extemporaneously, their bodies and their words are in unison. Their gestures, facial expressions, bodily movements, and sounds of their voice form a seamless whole. And that's really true. I have been told by a few people that I really need to do better in my introductions to the podcast. They say, and I've had two people just in the past couple of months tell me that when they recommend podcast for inquiry to their friends, they say, it's a really good podcast. You just have to ignore the first 90 seconds. Don't form your impression, because that's when I'm reading the bio and I'm giving my summary of the conversation. I'm not engaged in the conversation. And they said he's a really good. I really enjoy his conversations and his interviews with his guests, and they're great topics and great conversation. And he's terrible at the summary. So I obviously need to get better at that. And I'm going to really try and do a good job with the summary of this conversation. But it's the difference between a prepared speech, or where I've got a goal, and when I'm just having a general conversation with that. It reminds me of an old expression like sincerity. Once you can fake that, you've got it made. And so do rhetoricians also study what you write in quotation, bodies and words, the tone of voice, the gestures, the facial expressions, the body language, all of that. Is that also in the rhetorician's ambit?
Traditionally, yes. Traditionally, rhetoricians, there were 5 canons of rhetoric, one of which was delivery. And some rhetoricians, Demosthenes was one who said delivery was the only one of the canons that mattered. The canons just meant the 5 parts, the 5 fundamental components: invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. And so delivery coming last is like when you actually deliver the speech. You'd think, oh, maybe that's the least important, but no. In the long history of the rhetorical tradition, it was viewed as really the most crucial and the most important, and the most important aspect of it was the ability.
I remember taking a course as an undergrad where about public speaking, and they said that people remember 20% of their impression is formed 20% of what you say, and 80% of their impression is formed by how you say it. So like delivery, and that was quoted. This was a few years ago. I was an undergrad, not yesterday, but that was the most recent research that 80% of the impression that your audience carries away from you is based on your delivery.
And done well, how you say it can lead people to remember what you say as well, right? That's
Yes.
one thing that the ancients understood much better than we do today. Yeah, there's a famous story about Cicero that he's from the floor of the Senate delivered a really long discourse that had the entire Senate just completely spellbound, and it was entirely impromptu, completely unplanned, unpremeditated, off the cuff. And he sat down, and the whole assembly was silent. And the person next to him said, "How long did you practice that?" And he said, "My entire life," right? My whole life. But he was not kidding though. Like the way people studied rhetoric was they orated at length. They studied long passages. They committed long passages of literary and historical text to memory. It was just all there for instant recall. So when they were called on in the moment to speak on a topic off the cuff, they could do it, but they could do it beautifully. They could do it eloquently. They could do it in a way that grabbed and held their audience's attention, because they'd been drilling year over year over year how to master the language, how to keep their mouths wrapped around the words. So they're constantly there, ready to be drawn on. So delivery was enormously important, and it's one of the things that we neglect when we don't study those ancient arts, those long-standing, long-proven, effective arts of communication.
Yeah, and there are certain, I don't know what to call them. I guess shortcuts is something that I guess will work in until I can think of a better word that we use. And you identified one in your book when in that somehow and for some reason we invest, if someone describes themselves or their product or their company as alternative, we tend to view it. Let me quote what you write. We automatically give ourselves over to the mistaken impression that alternative, as opposed to mainstream, is somehow better or more trustworthy because it has the courage to question the dominant view and isn't bogged down with party lines, political affiliations, stodgy mainline opinions, or burdensome editorial hierarchies. And like this is true in a lot of places. The largest the cable news channel with the largest audience in the U.S. refers to itself as an alternative station. Again, back, I'm going to refer to my undergraduate days. I'm old enough that CDs, compact discs, you might remember those. The alternative music genre sold more CDs than the popular music genre, which even at the time made me question the meaning of those words. Alternative medicine is a $120 billion business globally, which is a major industry by any reasonable definition. So my question is, why does the alternative label work so well across so many domains? What is it about it that is so appealing to so many of us?
Well, I think you've already answered your own question in some ways. I think that the idea of something being alternative has this allure of a kind of independence to it, right?
I want to think for myself just like everybody else.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not something that's being spoon-fed to me. It's something that I'm choosing, right? Alternative carries with it this kind of implicit idea of choice. So, yeah, I think you've already, and I would note that that's a really good example of thinking rhetorically, noticing this recurring term, alternative, and noticing that across different domains, it has a sort of similar sort of effect. It has a similar kind of outcome, or it lends a certain perspective, or it casts a certain light in a similar way across different genres, across different contexts. I think, yeah, it's a really good example of rhetorical thinking right there. But yeah, I think you've already nailed it. That it has the allure of independence. It has the allure of self-direction.
Yeah, there was another thing that I read in your book that also like spoke to me, and you write that if we can be provoked to fear, we'll want to take action, and if someone suggests that one form of actions offers hope of safety, it ameliorates our fear, and and I see that all the time, in particularly in two domains, although it's in a lot of places. One is the obvious one is political discourse, right? If you vote for that other party, the wrong party, the bad party, it'll be the end of the world. Certainly society is going to collapse. You're going to go bankrupt. The wolves will be at your door. Whereas if you vote for me, we'll be returned to a golden age, or maybe the first one, depending on the rhetoric. But everything will be great. You just have to vote for me. But the emphasis really is don't vote for the other guy because they're terrible. But the other place that I see that all the time and have for decades is in advertising, right? You create the fear that then your product solves, right? Don't smell bad. If you smell bad, no one will date you. You'll never find a spouse. People will reject you, lose your social standing. But if you use our deodorant, you'll be the most comely person on the planet. And so is this like based, and it's an incredibly effective technique, and because it's created entire product categories, and negative campaigning has won elections time and time again. So it's not a particularly rational approach, but it's an incredibly effective one. And I'm wondering if is this just due to our evolutionary history that we, will do anything to avoid, well, not anything, but we would much prefer to avoid a loss than to reap a gain? Like, why is this so effective, again, across so many domains?
Well, a lot of people have different explanations from different disciplines. Like, this is actually something that's studied in evolutionary biology. It's actually studied in brain science. But okay. Rhetoricians, you were quoting me, but it was not me. It's Aristotle. I'm just telling you what okay. Aristotle he's the first person in the Western tradition to offer an analysis of the emotions, and it happens in his text on rhetoric. And the reason the very first analysis of the emotions in the Western tradition happens in a text on rhetoric is because Aristotle saw the link directly from using words to excite emotions to get things to happen in politics. Like, it was just a 1, 2, 3, very obvious. I mean, you're saying you see it in advertising and politics as well. Aristotle, they didn't have advertising, but he saw it in politics in the same sense. And what he observed has actually been kind of proven true scientifically now, using methods Aristotle didn't have access to. But one thing he observed about negative emotions like anger and fear, not fear, but anger, he says that we enjoy feeling angry. It's sweet to us. It's a good feeling. It's not necessarily the most obvious thing to us, but there is some kind of pleasure. There's some sort of visceral pleasure we take in feeling anger. And that's actually something that is documented in brain science now. There's an addictive quality to negative emotions and negative thoughts like anger. Aristotle's explanation for that was we enjoy thinking through what would happen if we had some satisfaction to our anger. He says we enjoy thinking about someone that's made us angry, that is deserving of our revenge. We enjoy imagining them getting what they've got coming. So rhetoric's explanation of this, again, from the beginning, from Aristotle, is that negative emotions work really well, in part because we get attached to them. We develop a kind of affinity to hanging on to those thoughts, as he diagnosed, but also because negative emotions like anger, like fear, propel us to deliberate about doing something about it. We don't like the agitation that comes from these feelings at the same time, and we imagine
so we both crave it and want the catharsis of the relief of it going away. Which is
actually the term he uses. So one explanation there then for why it would be so useful in politics and useful in advertising, as Aristotle says, is it makes people prone to deliberate. He means that in a very specific and technical sense. When he's talking about deliberation, he's saying prone to decide about what course of action to follow, right? If you don't feel that way, you're unlikely to choose a course of action. You're unlikely to do anything. You're unlikely to pull out your pocketbook. You're unlikely to vote for a candidate. You might stay home from the polls, right? He says you're going to act. You're much more likely to be propelled to act if you're put in the position of feeling a negative emotion. And he says you can be made to feel a negative emotion through the use of certain language. He identifies things like vivid description, right? The vivid description, ekphrasis, that brings before the eyes some idea of some horrible thing happening. You can see that happening in advertising. You can see that happening in politics, right? He says it's super effective because all of a sudden it becomes very real to you.
Right.
The rhetoric has been aware of this from the very beginning. And I think one of the most interesting things about that particular rhetorical technique is how much it's just Aristotle's description could read like he's describing what's on YouTube today. Like it reads as so current and so prescient. But at the same time, despite its age and despite its like long-standing truism, it's still one of these things that we're so unaware of when it's happening. Like there's still this effect that when we feel angry or when we feel fearful, we have a tendency to take the things we're imagining as causing the anger or the fear as real because we're having this sort of bodily experience. That's another thing that Aristotle pointed out. It has this tendency to bypass our critical judgment about thinking,
right. And you just have this visceral reaction that you're going to do something about.
I'm thinking that it's the thing itself rather than the language that's making us feel that way. So one thing that rhetoric is supposed to do is say, no, pay attention to the language that's making you feel that way. How is it that the language prompted that reaction? That right there is the difference between thinking rhetorically and not.
And I mean, and that's how I think. That's how you get this enormous disconnect between violent crime on this enormous downward trend over the last several decades, where assaults and murders are at historical low rates. There was a little blip during the pandemic, but it's continued its downward trend, and people feeling ever more unsafe because it's not, as the chances of bad things happening goes down, people's fear of bad things happening has been increasing steadily. Is that a related phenomenon as a result of, or is that just is that something different?
Well, I think the answer that would be provided by the rhetorical tradition is just that you could be made to be fearful given the right language, right? You could be made to be fearful and angry,
independent of the facts, independent of reality.
Precisely, the language can provoke that response to you anytime, or can provoke that response in you anytime.
There's another section of your book that made me where you talked about the fall of Athens, so in antiquity, but it was something that I have seen again and again. And you wrote, and please correct my pronunciation if I get it wrong, Alcibiades made the case that it is better to prioritize personal advantage over public interest precisely on the grounds that personal advantage was public interest and that the two were indistinguishable from each other. And I've noticed exactly that argument in a few places. If you go back a little under a century, you see what's good for GM is good for the country. And the lead up to Desert Storm, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, you heard what's good for the oil industry is good for America. And even more recently, when Donald Trump was first running for president after he got the Republican nomination, he claimed that not paying taxes made him smart. And so that you want someone smart. So this thing that I did that was good for me is actually going to be good for the country, and you should vote for me. And so it seems to be a consistent set of behaviors. How and a lot of these are not just. It's not actually an alignment of personal incentive and public good. These are people that are taking from the public good and just enriching themselves, but we fall for it again and again and again. What is it that makes this conflation of personal aggrandizement and personal enrichment and the public interest? Why do we conflate these two so consistently?
So, I mean, to answer it as a rhetorician, right? Not as a a political scientist or an economic theorist. As a rhetorician, what's interesting about that speech, and you can call him Alcibiades, you can call him Alcibiades. I'm not picky. What was interesting about that speech and what was novel about that speech was not that he was making an argument in favor of self-interest. Self-interest goes back to the oldest text that we have. You can find the case for self-interest. It's a naturally occurring set of priorities. What was weird about it and what was radical about it in the context was that he was trying to convince his audience that self-interest was not at odds with democratic principles. The whole idea of a democracy as opposed to an oligarchy or any other kind of dynastic organization was that its constituents made decisions on the basis of the public good as opposed to self-interest, as opposed to the interest of the clan or the tribe or the family individually. He was trying to make this argument, and he was making this argument precisely because the sophists had taught the ancient Greek, the Athenians. The sophists had taught them how to turn an argument on its head. You can actually make an argument out of anything. You can make any kind of contrapositive claim you want. Here's how you do it, right? So he was trying his hand. Alcibiades was trying his hand at precisely that technique. So why people would want to conflate those things, I mean, I think there's kind of an obvious answer, but I'm not answering this question as a rhetorician or as a scholar of rhetoric. When I say this, it's like natural to want to defend yourself. It's natural to want to do what's best for yourself. It's natural to be self-interested. The requirements of a democracy are that you put those self-interests aside from time to time to do something that's for the public good, like paying your taxes, right? It's in Donald Trump's interest not to pay taxes because it's more personal wealth for him, but it's not in the public interest because it's less wealth for the common good. It's less wealth going into things like schools and parks. So what's interesting to a rhetorician is that that's this moment where someone is able to make a convincing argument that is convincing to the audience that knows it's not true. It's been proven time and again, generation after generation, hard-won wisdom that it's not true, that it's not the case. And yet they're being pulled in the direction of believing something that they know to be false, that they know that the falsehood of would be harmful, right? Even with that sort of hard-won wisdom and hard-won generational knowledge, they're still convinced of it because he's been able to use rhetoric to make it possible for them to believe it.
Okay. Well, there's so much more in your book. I've got one more question. I'll get to that in a moment. There's so much more in your book that I want to talk to you about. There's structuralism. There's you introduced the idea of proofiness, which was great. Stasis theory. You get into the Obama as Kenyan kerfuffle that happened a few years ago. There's a lot more to this book, and I do recommend that people pick up a copy and read it because I learned a lot, and I'm fairly confident that you will too. So I want to thank you, but there's one more piece. I want to go back to Athenian democracy because the way you described it sounded utopian. You said you write that people gave thoughtful speeches on the issues, weighed the pros and cons, responded to the positions of the adversaries, defended themselves against attack, and gave reasoned arguments for their proposed plan of action. Like that sounds almost like an ideal society to me. That's part of what I'm trying to achieve here with Podcast for Inquiry. You also write towards the end of your book, asking questions to develop and enhance points of agreement is a rhetorical form that responds appropriately to the essential plurality of political life. What kind of politics is reflected in our general tendency nowadays to broadcast our opinions rather than inquire into another's, to repeat our own point of view rather than understand our interlocutors, and to shout down rather than converse with our opponent. And again, that's something that I'm very much trying to achieve with my work at the Center for Inquiry Canada, and I'm hoping I'm living up to that ideal with the podcast for inquiry. And one final quotation of your is that I didn't like that I was always grasping for what to think rather than figuring out how to think. And I really believe that if more people felt this way, I think we'd all be better off. So if I were to summarize your book, it's that people are using words to manipulate you and to try and control what you're thinking and to prevent you from learning how to think. And this book is a good tool to at least start you down the path of breaking out, of identifying. Because if you can identify the tools that people are using to manipulate you, that's the first step in preventing that manipulation from taking effect. So I'll give the last, I want to say thank you. It's a great book. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I want to give the last word to you. So any last thoughts? There's so much in here that we didn't cover, and please feel free to introduce any of that or make a comment on any of our conversations so far.
Yeah, I would just say, one caveat: ancient Greece, ancient Athens was far from a utopia. I mean, it was a cruel state. It was a cruel and vicious state. But where language was concerned, there was something going on there. We have things to learn from the ancient Greeks, from the ancient Athenians. And the reason for that was because speech and language was what made it possible for them to democratically organize according to that common public good, as opposed to self-interest and oligarchic power. So yeah, I would just say is not a utopic state, but it did have an understanding and a value for language and for speech and for understanding language and speech and how it operates that we've lost by not studying rhetoric, but it can be regained by studying that tradition anew, which is precisely what my book is trying to do. The texts in which the skills of rhetoric and the theories of rhetoric are encoded are very difficult to read. And so I've tried to grasp out what I consider to be really the most valuable for our moment right now and our political moment today, and make them digestible and understandable for the average reader. So that they can begin to understand how language is working behind the scenes all the time to influence their view of reality.
And I fell into that old trap of this previous golden age. So there was one good aspect of that, but it was not a golden age. But maybe we still have, for all their flaws.
It was vicious, and I wouldn't have even been a person. So
right.
I don't.
You've got the wrong
genitalia
for that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. So we've lost a lot that we can regain, but we've also made significant progress.
Made some progress in other ways. Yeah.
So to start, read The Ancient Art of Thinking for Yourself. If people want to learn more about you, do you have a presence online where people can follow or read more?
I don't. I'm not on social media, but I'm always happy to receive emails.
Okay.
You can find me from my institutional websites.
All right. Wonderful. Well, Robin Reames, this has been a great conversation. There's so much more that I would like to ask and talk to you about, but I want to respect your time. Thank you once more for speaking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thank you, Leslie.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please show your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry and give us a 5-star review. Email us at podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, centerforinquiry.ca. We are on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter or X at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazzaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood. See you next time.